Well, welcome everybody. Heath Putzel from Keep Your Finger in the Text here with a Tuesday Keep Your Finger in the Text live report. And here's what's going on at Keep Your Finger in the Text. Monday nights, we have Taking Reps. We're studying Psalm 34, and we've explored the gospel connections in Psalm 34, the ways that the text is organically bringing out the gospel and the facets of the gospel. And I will tell you, with Psalm 34, it is rich, it is deep with gospel connections. We have gospel connections going all the way to Peter's letter, all the way back to the Passover. And it's a great time of just exploring the depth. And one of the things we noticed in Taking Reps is when we get to the gospel connections, we're not just talking about it, we're exploring them. And that means that we get to see the richness and the depthness of the gospel in Psalm 34. But what is Taking Reps, you may ask? Taking Reps is an excellent practical extension opportunity from our workshops. We continually put the tools, the principles, the strategies to work on our biblical texts. There's not a whole lot of instruction going on, although we ask questions and try to derive a little bit more about what we're working on. But it's open to diving into the text and really pulling out the text or pulling out the meaning of the text and all of the facets that we're working on our roadmap to rhetoric. And it also puts into practice almost like a mental repetition with our text moving toward the point of preaching sermons in the open air. And we come out of it after about 6 or 8 sessions, one time a week, 1 hour a week. We meet Monday nights, and it gives us the opportunity to walk away with an outline for us to preach in our minister context. I know you've heard on past updates, or you may not have, but it's very similar to like a professional athlete or an actor or an actress or any profession. We're really driving in taking reps and building that repetition so we can hone our craft. You can hear from those who have been participating in taking reps and what to expect in a previous live report. I'll go ahead and put that link in the notes description here. But come join us. Come see the tools, principles, and strategies in use. We record all of our sessions so that you can go back and review them as well. You'll have access to those recorded sessions while you are in taking reps. And it's open registration. And we don't necessarily want to say, oh, nope, you can't join. So come join us. And we do jump in and out after about 6 or 8 weeks. If you want to know when the next one's coming up, let me know. I'll be more than happy to let you know when we're on to our next text. Tonight, we are closing in on the finish of our Gospel of Mark workshop. And the last 2 sessions are going to be on our small group sessions. And this is really the heart of our workshop. It's where those who are participating have been spending probably about a month to 6 weeks diligently working on their text. It's based out of the Gospel of Mark, and that means it's in the Gospel of Mark. So our small group texts are coming out of the book that we're working on. And this gives those who are participating the opportunity to really dive in and put into practice their first opportunity anyway, with immersing themselves in a text and working on the text. And then they'll present it in the small group workshop, and they receive interactive feedback on their work. And we challenge them on ways to progress, driving them back to the text. It's not subjective as in, I think you should have done this better. It's a way for us to help those who have presented their text really engage with it, really interact with it, and using the tools, principles, and strategies and different ways to go back to the text and think about these things. And since we're closing in on our Gospel of Mark workshop, all of our instructional sessions have been recorded. They'll soon be out after we do a little bit of editing anyway, and be available for you to walk through the Gospel of Mark out in the SFOI store. It will come with some additional time for cohort sessions for us to interact and to work on a text and receive feedback as well. So that's what's going on with the workshops. there's going to be another workshop coming up here shortly. We're working on the details of that. And that's going to happen right after the George Whitfield program, which I'll talk about in a moment. And we're going to explore the epistles. We're going to explore one of Paul's epistles in discourse. I guess you could say a discourse literary type. So we're going to be working on the book of Colossians as we go through our next workshop. And the details are being finalized when we're going to kick off the start date of that. So be aware of that coming up. I'll announce that in future Keep Your Finger in the Text live updates. And you can find out more information out at sfoi.org. Go to Evangelist Info and keep your finger in the text, and we'll have that information out there as well. But coming up here in a few short weeks, the George Whitfield program, you'll start to see more interviews talking about the George Whitfield program, both from Bill with his live updates, as well as Keep Your Finger in the Text as well. And we want to share with you an extension and a part of SFOI is for those who want to go full-time or are looking to endeavor full-time or looking to ultimately dive in and see what preachers have done in the past. And then how do we also work to make progress in those areas? So coming up June 20th through the 24th, the George Whitfield Program Summer Fellowship Conference in Birchwood, Tennessee. It's a great time of a week where we spend immersed in the Word, immersed together, worshiping together at night, and bring your families along as well to join with us in meals and the family worship time. And the families can also get to know each other a little bit better as well, and have some activities for them. But there's two tracks in the George Whitfield program. The first track, or track one anyway, are those who have an interest in going full-time, where they learn about what it's like to transfer from where they are right now to the life of a full-time evangelist, devoted to prayer and ministry of the Word. And what that role looks like, what the transitioning looks like, talking about ministry partnership development, i.e. fundraising anyway, and building support and a team of support, and how your life really revolves around your role as an evangelist. And then we have track two that's offered because part of it is the ministry of the Word, and that's where Keep Your Finger in the Text. We'll be hosting a live workshop with several guys working on preaching Proverbs. And in track two, we're going to assign two texts. One of those will be used as a small group session out of the book of Proverbs, and the other one will be used to preach a 15 to 20 minute sermon. And they'll both be provided interactive feedback, both right after the sermon and the small group presentation as well with the other participants. And again, we engage in interactive feedback to drive them to back to the text and make progress in those areas. But, even if you say, I don't want to go full time, or I don't know if I'm called to go full time, or, can I jump into track two without being in the George Whitfield program? And the answer is yes. Come either way. If you want to gain the tools, principles, and strategies to improve your ministry context and preaching the Word, or if you want to be around men who love talking about preaching, talking about making progress, and working through a biblical book, come join us. Come join us. It's June 20th through the 24th, Birchwood, Tennessee, preaching Proverbs in track two. And you can go out to the GeorgeWhitfieldProgram.org Fellowship Conference. And again, I'll put that information in our notes here of our live session. But this morning, I want to talk about walking the terrain of the text. Part of being faithful to the text is being aware of what God is saying, and He is saying and trying to accomplish through the biblical authors to their audience, and then as an extension to us as well. Not shying away from God's Word, not looking to add to His Word, not looking to take away from His Word. And, we were kind of talking about that last night, talking about, the psalm that we're in, bringing thanksgiving, bringing hope, bringing, in the midst of distress and trials, bringing deliverance as being one of God's own. And how that translates is it's not only the words that are written down on the page, but it's also the tone in which those words are written in Scripture and how they're conveyed. And how does that impact our proclamation of it? Now, I know we're being removed from the original audience and we're being removed from the original author, and we weren't there to hear those words originally read. But the language, the original language, conveys a certain tone to it. And then the translators, as they've translated it into English, give us that sense and that tonal quality as well. As I mentioned, we were in Psalm 34, and there's praise and there's thanksgiving, and there's this contrast between the righteous and the unrighteous, the righteous being delivered, the righteous being cared for and provided for by the Lord, and yet the unrighteous, talking about destruction, their names being completely written out and removed, being condemned. And this should carry a tone as we preach it as well. You know, similarly, we see the prophet Nahum, and it starts out in the beginning of chapter 1 with God being a vengeful and a wrathful God, God taking vengeance on his enemies. He will by no means clear the guilty. And it carries a certain pointed tone to it, a weighty tone, a tone that talks about vengeance and wrath and a righteous anger that God has for those who rebel against him. But then later on, it talks about the Lord is good. He's a stronghold in a day of trouble. He knows those who take refuge in him. And this brings not a serious tone, but it brings a more joyous tone, that those who seek refuge in the Lord knows those who are his, those who seek refuge, and he is good. And that should convey through the way that we preach the text, not just the words that are preached, but also understanding the tone, understanding what the author is conveying, even with the weightiness or the joyousness of the text. And we want to be aware of it and carry and convey that tone in our preaching as well. It'll add depth to our preaching, a depth out the way the original audience had heard it, the original author had intended it, and how they would have understood it. And we need to preach that way as well. So it'll help our audience understand and connect with the text and not give mixed signals with the text. Now, you may be saying that varying your tone may seem like dramatics. It may seem like I'm trying to manipulate the audience. If you look back at some of the historical accounts and the biographies and the autobiographies anyway, or semi-autobiographies of George Whitfield, George Whitfield was charged with being a divine dramatist, As one of his critics said, that he was almost as if he was giving a one-act play in his preaching. And yes, if you look at the history, George Whitfield did study acting in school, but he was not for sure acting as if he was preaching in a superficial way to manipulate the audience, to try to drum up this emotional aspect. He was bringing emphasis where emphasis was at. He was bringing tonal qualities consistent with his text and consistent with the message that he was preaching. And we want to do the same. We want to have our tone. We want to have our voice. We want to have our volume consistent with the message we are preaching. We don't preach about sin, law, judgment, righteousness, the serious, grave attributes of God that have a serious point in tone, the same way that we preach about God's mercy, God's grace, God's forgiveness, God's kindness, God's compassion, his long suffering. There's a difference in the tone of the text when those are being preached. And we want to mimic that as well. We want to mimic that in our preaching so that We don't preach with the same tone, the same volume, the same intensity when we preach about these things, such as sin, righteousness, judgment, the law, wrath, as we do God's mercy, grace, forgiveness, compassion, and some of the other attributes that I don't want to say are more positive, but can convey a message of not so, I guess, a serious, grave tone. When we preach about hope, we should be rejoicing in that hope in those cases. When we're preaching about the judgment, it has a different weight carried to it. And this is what we talk about when we talk about walking the terrain of the text. We're not trying to add to the text. We're not trying to say more than what God has said. We're expounding and explaining the text, but we're not adding to it by trying to say more than what God is trying to get done. We're also not trying to say less. We're not trying to round off those rough edges as if, sin and judgment and righteousness and the qualities of who God is should be demeaned or diminished in any way to make him seem more favorable. We want to walk the terrain of the text and be faithful to the text. And part of doing that is knowing not just the words that are saying, not just knowing what is being conveyed as far as the emphasis of the author and the original intention of the author. It's also conveying the tone and the volume in the tone with those areas as well. Otherwise, we risk providing an inconsistent message or a confusing message to our ministry context. If you're preaching at, a full emphasis and a full serious tone about, John 3:16, it's going to come off very, very weird. If you're preaching with a tone of sin when you talk about John 3:16, it's going to come off very inconsistent with the message itself. We want to vary our tone. Again, not to manipulation, not to whip up manipulation. I know Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. He preached it monotone because he didn't want his voice, inflections, and the tone of his sermon to think that it would be manipulative. And it's not. It's conveying the tone of the text is what we're really after. And that's why walking the terrain of the text is just as important as not the words that are being said, but the tone that is being carried and also the tone that should be carried and conveyed through our proclamation as well. Not just, you've heard it, it's not just what's being said, but how it's being said. And that's the same thing with our preaching. We're not just preaching what God has said, we're also wanting to preach how God has conveyed that with the emphasis and the tonal qualities that are consistent with the text. So that's what's going on with Keep Your Finger in the Text with our live update and our live report. If you have questions about our live reports, if you want any assistance with things like, how should I integrate anyway my Bible software, whether it's Accordance, whether it's BibleWorks, whether it's Logos, into your preaching, give me a call. I'd like to help you with that as we work through integrating Bible software in preparing our sermons. If you've gone through a workshop and you want to dive into taking reps or are not quite sure, give me a call, contact me. heathputzel@gmail.com, heathputzel@gmail.com. Still working on another facet of Keep Your Finger in the Text, which is office hours, an opportunity for us to engage in maybe a book study on preaching, where we take a look at either Martin Lloyd-Jones or take a look at even sermons and talk about sermons from George Whitfield or some of the other authors that are out there on preaching so that we can continue to hone our craft. Also, things like questions that we have, or even if you want one-on-one consultation, you're working on a text and you want feedback on it, or you want another set of eyes on it, reach out, contact me. I'd love to be able to help you out. Again, as I've said it before, not trying to usurp the local church itself, but want to help you in your ministry context as you preach in the open air. and being an open air preacher as well, being very familiar with our ministry context and the craft of focusing in on the areas of the message that we want to get the full weight and the conveyance of the message without sometimes the minute nuances that have the opportunity in a pulpit preaching. So reach out to me if you have any questions, heathputzel@gmail.com, heathputzel@gmail.com. Otherwise, go out to sfoi.org, keep your finger in the text or taking reps, fill out a get in touch form, and that'll come straight to me. I'll reach out to you, see how we can help you out as you make progress in preaching the word. Because here at Keep Your Finger in the Text, we provide the path to practical, persuasive, powerful preaching, and I want to be able to help you out any way I can. So reach out to me on sfoi.org. Love to see you at a workshop, either online or at the George Whitfield program live with the workshop, or at any of the SFOI events. Or if you want to come to Wisconsin, come give me a call. Contact me and we'll get together at a ministry outreach. So until then, keep your finger in the text, keep proclaiming Christ until he takes us home.